For the last month or so, we have been investigating evidence for not only God's existence, but also for the Christian faith and the theistic worldview. And there's some things that we've discovered by looking at evidence so far in science and philosophy and other realms. A few things that we saw is that we discovered beyond a reasonable doubt that God exists. I mean, beyond a reasonable doubt, God exists. And the evidence has also pointed out the fact that theism is the most reasonable, logical worldview. We looked at what we learned about God from the evidence, the characteristic of God, what he would be like, and we were kind of able to eliminate some other worldviews and come to this idea of theism, that there is one all-powerful God who is outside of time, outside of space, outside of creation, but is the source of all creation. We saw last week, beyond a reasonable doubt, that Jesus was a real person and that the New Testament is a 2,000-year-old document that has been meticulously preserved. As we looked at evidence beginning in the New Testament last week, we saw that the things that the New Testament writers wrote about were written very close to the events in which they described, and that those manuscripts, we have thousands of them, so that we know that they have been meticulously preserved and that we can reconstruct the original with accuracy. But the skeptic of the New Testament may say, so what? So the books were written close to the actual events that they describe and that they were well preserved. That doesn't make them true. Just because a book is well preserved and it's written close to the supposed events doesn't make a book true. It doesn't mean that the events actually happen. And I think that those are really great points. I've heard those questions before. And that's why today, as we continue the series, Why I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, we're going to look at the credibility of the Bible, particularly the New Testament. Is it a compilation of stories that are made up, stories that are lies, stories that are exaggerated, stories that are embellished? Or is it an actual historical account that can be trusted to communicate things that really happen? Let me just begin by saying that if you're here today and you would consider yourself to be spiritually skeptical, you're questioning things about God, I am glad you're here. And we consider Newday to be a safe place to be on a spiritual journey, regardless of where you find yourself. And let me just say, I can't prove the things I'm talking about today. We've been saying this all along. We can't prove things like, is there a God? We can't prove that there isn't a God. We can't prove, how the universe began or where life came from. We can't prove that Jesus was actually a real person or that the Bible is something that we can trust. But what we can do is we can look at the evidence. And the evidence can lead us to reasonable conclusions. And as we've been saying all along, the more evidence we have for a truth claim, the less faith we need. The less evidence we have for a truth claim, the more faith we need. And what we've been saying is, based on the evidence, it takes a lot more faith to be an atheist and say God doesn't exist than to actually look at the evidence and say God does exist. So again, we're dealing in the realm of probability, not 100% certainty. A second word to doubters: if you're here today and you say, you know what, I've got doubts, I've got questions. I'm a Christian, I have doubts, or I'm a kind of skeptical side of things, I have doubts. If you're here today and you have doubts, let me just say you are in very good company. There have always been doubters. Doubt in the Bible is as old as the Bible itself. And the fact that you have doubts is not because of the fact that you live 2,000 years after the time that the Bible was written, or because you live in an age of enlightenment, or because you're more educated than people who lived 2,000 years ago. We often live in this, or we feel this kind of historical snobbery in which we think we are the enlightened and the educated people, and people who lived 2,000 years ago, well, they would just buy anything. I mean, oh, he was dead and he rose 3 days later. Oh, it must be magic. Or, they just buy anything. We have this idea that's the way people were, but nothing could be further from the truth, because chances are, if you have doubts today, you would have had doubts 2,000 years ago, even if you were eyewitness to the things that the New Testament reports. Because we can know this because many of those who saw the things that the New Testament reports had doubts 2,000 years ago. And the Bible is very upfront about that, which I think gives the Bible all the more credibility. It reports on the doubters. John chapter 20, for instance, talks about one of Jesus' 12 disciples, Thomas, as we know of as Doubting Thomas, right? Thomas hears that Jesus is resurrected, and he makes this bold statement: I'm not going to believe it until I see him with my own eyes, and I put my fingers where the nails went through his hands, and I put my hand into his side where the spear went in. I'm not going to believe it. Well, Thomas actually got to do those things, and he became a believer. Or in Matthew chapter 28, Matthew records that the resurrected Jesus, so he had died, he'd been buried, now he's alive again. The resurrected Jesus appears to the disciples in Matthew chapter 28. He keeps this appointment. Matthew records this. He says, "Then the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain where Jesus had told them to go. When they saw him, they worshiped him, but some doubted." I mean, the guy was dead, now he's alive, and they're like, I'm not sure how this all worked out. Some of them doubted because they were enlightened enough to know that dead people didn't walk out of the grave after 3 days. And this really gets at the heart of the objection of many spiritual skeptics. The problem that many have with the Bible, it's this idea of miracles. Miracles. I don't see miracles. I've never seen a miracle. Therefore, I don't believe in miracles. This is a common objection raised among atheists and naturalists and skeptics. Miracles can't happen. And by miracle, what I mean, let's be clear in our terms, a miracle would be something that happens outside of the realm of natural causes. Something that can't be described or explained by natural law or natural causes. It happens outside of that. Now, there's a common misunderstanding or understanding among atheists and agnostics and naturalists that miracles, they're just not possible. And that would be understandable if God doesn't exist. If God doesn't exist, I'm with you. Miracles can't happen. But so far, we've shown the evidence that beyond a reasonable doubt, God does exist. We live in a theistic world. Therefore, if we live in a theistic universe, miracles certainly would be possible. God could do what he wants to do when he wants to do it. And if we're actually going to get down to it, we've already talked about two of the greatest miracles in the history of the universe that we've demonstrated would be, number one, the creation of the entire universe out of nothing. That's pretty spectacular. That God would just speak a word or do whatever he does and boom, there's nothing, and then everything that we know, all matter, time and space and energy, all kind of comes out of nothing. That is a miracle. It can't be explained by natural laws. Therefore, it is a miracle. Or think about the creation of life and the variety of life, the complexity of life. Where did it come from? It can't be explained by natural causes. Therefore, it is a miracle that we believe God led that. Those are two amazing miracles that God has already pulled off. And so if he can create the universe out of nothing and create the variety and complexity of life out of nothing, certainly he can walk on water if he wants, or change water into wine, or, split a sea in half, or even raise the dead. But a common question that comes with miracles is, well then, if miracles were happening in the Bible, why don't we see miracles today with the same kind of frequency or prevalence that we see them in the Bible? Many Christians have this question. Why do I read about all these miracles in the book of Acts, but I've not seen many miracles like that in my life? And the answer to that question, I think, is found as we look at the purpose for miracles. Why does God perform miracles in the first place? What's the reason for them? I believe as we look at the evidence, particularly in the Bible, that God uses miracles very strategically and very intentionally. As we look at when miracles are used and how they're used, we see that they're typically used by God to communicate that he's doing something big. He's doing something new. He wants his people to go in a new direction, or he wants to confirm a new person as a leader. He wants to give credibility to that leader. Therefore, he will work miracles through that person. And we often have this idea that miracles were just happening all over the place in Bible times. Like if you're a family in Bible times, conversation over the dinner would be like, what miracle did you see today, honey? I mean, they're just like everywhere. But that's not the case. Really, as we look at the miracles in the Bible, we see that they're kind of around three major time frames. And when we see miracles in the Bible, most are around the time of Moses and the Exodus, a time when he's really doing something new. He's calling a people to himself. He's establishing Moses as a very special leader who's going to be leading the people. Number two, around the time of the prophets Elijah and Elisha, a time when he's trying to call his people back to himself, when they're in a time of great apostasy. He's getting ready to do something new. Maybe they're going to go into exile soon. And then finally, the time of Jesus and the early church. This is a time when many miracles are being worked. And so during each of these time frames, God is working miracles, not just to kind of frivolously show off his power, but he's intentionally using his power to communicate something new. But there are hundreds of years that would go by in Bible times when little to no miracles were being recorded. That doesn't mean miracles weren't happening then, and it doesn't mean miracles don't happen now. I believe miracles do happen now, but maybe not with the same frequency that we see in the New Testament or during the time of Moses, because God has already confirmed through miracles that Jesus is his son. He has confirmed that the church is his body on earth through the miracles he performed in the first century. And let's be really clear. Something happened. The evidence says something happened shortly after the death of Jesus. Something happened that resulted in first thousands of doubting people, and then tens of thousands of skeptical people, and eventually millions of highly intelligent people to be able to say, we believe he died and rose again. Something happened. The evidence says something significant happened so that about 50 years after his death, the news about his death and resurrection and his teachings would have spread around the entire then known world. Something happened, the evidence says. Something so significant that nearly 2,000 years later, nearly 1 in 3 people on the planet would say this book is his inspired word and that Jesus is his son. Something significant happened after his death that would cause this kind of a movement. So the bottom line is doubt is natural, doubt is human, doubt will always exist. But at some point, we have to be willing to look at the evidence in the midst of our doubt, look at the evidence and say, what does the evidence point to? And I believe that the evidence points to the fact that the New Testament clearly demonstrates Jesus as God's Son and the church as his people. Just listen to what Peter writes in the New Testament. He writes this to both believers and skeptics, where he says, we did not follow cleverly invented stories when we told you about the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. Apparently, that was the rumor that was circulating that led Peter to write this, that the apostles just kind of made up this story about Jesus dying and raising from the dead. It was some cleverly invented story. Peter's like, no, time out. That's not what happened at all. He goes on to say, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty. And this is a theme that runs throughout the New Testament, a thread that all of the Bible writers share together, is that they were eyewitnesses of something. This isn't something they invented. It's not something they heard about. It is something they saw with their own eyes. They were eyewitnesses. They saw something that changed everything for them. Again and again, New Testament writers not only affirm, I was an eyewitness, but they point attention to other eyewitnesses and says, if you don't believe me, talk to them. They saw it too. These things didn't happen in a corner. There are plenty of people you can interview and get information from. There's one thing to say, okay, I was an eyewitness, I was there, I saw it, but it's another thing to demonstrate the fact that you're an eyewitness to something. And so the question is, really, as we come to the New Testament, try to give evidence for it. Is there evidence that these men who wrote these stories close to the events that were accurately copied, is there evidence they were actually eyewitnesses? And the answer is yes, there is plenty of evidence that there were actual eyewitnesses. I'd like to use Luke as a case study. Luke is a guy who wrote the Gospel of Luke, all about the life of Jesus, and then he wrote a second book that was called the Acts of the Apostles, in which he kind of documents the early history and the events of the birth and the spread of the Christian church. And he writes all of this as an eyewitness, particularly the book of Acts. Luke is a medical doctor. He was well educated, and he went to incredible lengths to record these historical evidence in meticulous detail, the things that he saw. Again, the book of Acts, in it, he writes down the prominent events that shapes the early church, like the ascension of Jesus back to heaven. He writes all about that. He writes about Peter's first sermon. He's kind of like taking notes, and he gives us a kind of a manuscript of Peter's first sermon. He talks about how the church spread, and he gives numbers for how many people were coming to faith. He talks about how certain church leaders were being persecuted and imprisoned. He talks about how the church started in Jerusalem, but then kind of started to spread out to Judea and Samaria. And then he tells this great story about the biggest enemy of the church, a guy by the name of Saul, how he went through this conversion experience and actually became not only a Christian, but the greatest proponent and mouthpiece of the church, and Luke and Paul, this guy, they end up becoming friends, and Luke ends up actually following Paul around in the latter half of the book of Acts, follows Paul all around the then known world, all over Asia, all over Europe. And he's following him on his missionary journeys. And just as you would expect from an eyewitness, he changes from the pronoun in the first half of his book, they, because he's talking about what he sees other people doing. All of a sudden he starts using the word we. We went, we saw, because he's an eyewitness. That is what you would expect from an eyewitness. Well, the second half of the book of Acts, Luke is going to correctly record details from places all over the world, things that only an eyewitness would be able to know. And you have to remember, he's going to be writing about things like local politicians, local business practices, local weather patterns, local topography. I mean, even like the depth of the water a quarter mile off of Malta as his ship is getting ready to run aground. He's writing about these incredible details that you can only know as an eyewitness in a world before Google, in a world before the internet, with no access to topographical maps or nautical charts. He's able to kind of give all of these details about the things that he saw as only an eyewitness could. Matter of fact, in the last half of the book of Acts, Luke will record 84 documented pieces of information that have since been confirmed, looking back through archaeology and history. 84 pieces of evidence that demonstrate the fact that he was clearly an eyewitness. Would you like to hear all 84 of them? Come on, no you don't. I'm not going to do that to you. I would love to do that to you because I find this really fascinating. But let me just share a couple. I'll share a couple of them with you. How about this? Luke shares the place of a conspicuous sailor's landmark, Samothrace. Only an eyewitness would know that. The proper locations where travelers would spend successive nights on a particular journey. We're in this city, then this city, then this city, then we got to this city. He would do that again and again through the book of Acts. That the Ephesian theater was the meeting place of the city. He correctly documents that in Acts chapter 19. This is fascinating. He uses the plural form of the noun for proconsuls in reference to the fact that two men were actually serving as proconsuls in Ephesus at the time rather than one man, which has actually been verified. There were actually two proconsuls when normally there would only be one. Luke properly documented that. The danger of a particular coastal trip, he documents. Whose jurisdiction Cilicia was in during the time that he is writing. Or the principal port to find a ship sailing to Italy. Luke could have told you that. He knew it. He was an eyewitness. Or how about I've got that there. The appropriate maneuvers for the safety of a ship in the midst of a storm. He documents perfectly. They're in the middle of a storm. They think they're going to die. He tells everything that the sailors are doing, trying to save the ship, exactly as a sailor in the first century would do. The correct depth of the water off the coast of Malta. I love this one. They're getting ready to run aground, and Luke records they're going to take soundings. They're sending these ropes with rocks on them overboard to see how deep the water is. Luke actually records how deep the water was based on the soundings. You can go back to Malta today. See, that's actually how deep the water is, a quarter mile off of the island. And then the local island people and the superstitions of the day. They land on this little island with this peculiar people, and he's talking all about them, giving a kind of a sociological lesson on what they're like. Luke tells that. I mean, these are only a few of the 84 such details in the last half of the book of Acts. I'm not going to bore you with the rest. But you can kind of get a sense, I mean, is there any question that Luke was actually there? He was an eyewitness to these things he was writing about. Is there anything more he could do to prove his authenticity as a historian, a reliable historian? Archaeologist William Ramsey, the late archaeologist William Ramsey, thought Luke was foolish for including so many details in the book of Acts. Because he's saying, these are things that we can go back and verify, and if they're not right, we could show that Luke was all washed up, that he was just making these things up, and that's what he believed. William Ramsey was an atheist archaeologist, and so he spent 30 years of his life kind of investigating all these 84 things and others, searching, digging. At the end, Ramsey concluded, Luke is a historian of the first rank. This author should be placed along with the very greatest of historians. And then he shocked the world. This atheist archaeologist came to faith in Christ based on the things he had discovered through the writings of Luke. But here's the thing. Luke doesn't only record 84 plus meticulous historical and geographical details in his book, the way only an accurate historian would. He also records 35 miracles in the same writing. And the way he records these miracles aren't like embellished stories with dragons and, weird things, but they're told with the same objective kind of attention to detail style that a historian would tell a story that's actually happening, the same way he did the rest of the book of Acts. In the words of Turek and Geisler, why would Luke be so accurate with trivial details like wind direction, water depths, peculiar town names, but not be accurate when it comes to important events like miracles? In light of the fact that Luke has proven accurate with so many trivial details, is it nothing but pure anti-supernatural bias to say he's not telling the truth about the miracles he records? You see the point? Luke is an eyewitness. He has been shown to be reliable with the details of his story. Why would he just throw miracles in if he has really nothing to gain? And we're going to see that he had nothing to gain. And we know that he's reliable because of the way he uses these historical crosshairs in his writings, not only in the book of Acts, but also in the book of Luke. You start to examine the book of Luke, the gospel about the life of Jesus. You see the same kind of writing, the same kind of historical crosshairs, the things that you can go back and verify again and again. So we know that the book of Luke is historically accurate. And if Luke is historically accurate, follow me here, then so is Matthew and Mark, because they all tell the same historical stories. So we have these accounts of the life of Jesus that we know are historically accurate. They have confirmable markers in history, things we can go back and verify. These men wrote these things down, were clearly eyewitnesses to the things that they saw. But many will say, okay, well, maybe they saw these things, or maybe they wrote these things down. But I think, because of the miracles, they're probably lying, or maybe they're just embellishing the truth a little bit. Maybe they're making some exaggerating stories. Again, the parts that people have the biggest problem with are the miracles themselves. These men must be exaggerating. They must be lying, because we don't see these same kind of miracles happening today, or we don't believe these kind of miracles can actually happen today. But here's the question. Why would they lie? What is their motive to exaggerate stories about miracles or the things that Jesus did? What would their motive be? What would they have to gain by telling these lies? Have you ever stopped to wonder that to yourself? What motive would they have, really? One of the biggest motives I'll often hear from people, skeptics, is that they did it for power. They wanted to have power for themselves. Therefore, they made up these grand stories to get people to kind of believe them and give them power. But power is the last thing they got. Read the stories. Because of what they preached, because of the stories they told, they didn't get power. They got persecuted, they got arrested, they got flogged, they were tortured, they were mocked, and almost all of them eventually gave their lives for the stories that they were telling. This is hardly a list of perks. Why would someone tell a lie that would get them to the point where, embellish a story so that you'll kill me for it? Clearly they weren't doing what they did for power. Others will say, well, they were doing it to start a new religion. They wanted to start a new movement so they could have this new religion. But why would they do that? They already believed that they were a part of the one true religion. All of them were Jewish. They were a part of a 2,000-year-old faith that taught that they were God's chosen people and that they were the way to heaven. So why would they feel a need to begin a new movement when they thought they were already a part of God's true movement? Especially considering if they're wrong, they would be calling down eternal damnation on themselves according to their own people and their own beliefs. We can be confident that the eyewitnesses who wrote the documents that have become the New Testament are telling the truth without exaggeration, without embellishment. Why? How can we know? Well, let me share with you, in their book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, Geisler and Turek, they give 10 reasons why we can know that the New Testament writers were telling the truth. I'm just going to share with you 3 for the sake of time, okay? But if you want 10, if you want 7 more, go to the book. But here's 3. Number 1, we can know that the New Testament writers told the truth because, number 1, they include embarrassing details about themselves in their stories. Now, if you're going to make up a story, if you're going to embellish details and play loose with the details of a story, most likely you're going to at least want to make yourself look kind of good, right? At the very least, you're not going to make yourself look like a moron. When When someone is telling you a story about something that they've experienced or somewhere they've been or something that's happened, and they make themselves out to look perfect, they're the hero, they knew everything was going to happen before it happened, they never made any mistakes. Or you listen to a person tell a story where they end up on the wrong side of things all the time, they made lots of mistakes, and they're completely humble. Which one is more believable? Usually the one that has some transparency about our own faults smells a little more of truth, and we're kind of in tune with that. And that's exactly the way the New Testament writers tell their stories. They show themselves time and time again to be clueless. I mean, clueless to the teachings of Jesus. I mean, Jesus will say something and they're like, do you get what he's saying? I'm going to rise again after 3 days of being dead. What do you think he means? Jesus says, I want you to be humble. To be the greatest means to be the least. Okay, Jesus, can I be first? I mean, they just were clueless, and this is the way they portray themselves all through the stories that they're writing. They show themselves to be uncaring. During Jesus' time of greatest need, his darkest hour, the night before he died, in the Garden of Gethsemane, he has one request: stay, watch with me, pray, just a little while. What do they say happened? We couldn't stay awake. We kept falling asleep. We know he needed us to pray, but we just kept falling asleep. They were uncaring. These are the stories they tell about themselves. They didn't even try to give their Lord a proper burial, but they were hiding while he was being buried. They leave that to the women and a couple of acquaintances. Oh, they'll take care of the burial. They show themselves to be uncaring. More than that, they continue to include all of the rebukes they received, like the time when Jesus lays into Peter, calls him Satan, because he has in mind the things of man versus the things of God. Or the time when James and John want to call down fire on a Samaritan village, and Jesus looks at them like, what are you thinking? Right? They include these stories about themselves, or they show themselves to be cowards time and time again. They all run away and they hide when Jesus goes to the cross. Would you write that in a story about yourself if you're making up the details? Peter even denies knowing Jesus 3 times, even after he swore he would never disown the Lord. And this to a little girl standing by a fire. I mean, meanwhile, while the guys are all running and hiding, the guys who wrote the story are all running and hiding. They talk about the brave women who stand by Jesus to the very end at the cross. Is that the way you'd make up the story if you're a guy writing 2,000 years ago? They show themselves, again, to be doubters, despite the fact Jesus told them again and again, they're going to kill me. 3 days later, I'm going to rise again. Even the night before he died, he said, they're going to kill me, but I'll meet you in Galilee. Don't forget, we have an appointment in Galilee. Still, when they hear news that Jesus rose again, they're all like, I don't believe it. No, it can't be. They were doubters. Until they saw him, they doubted. So let me just ask, if you're writing a story, you're making up details, you're playing loose, exaggerating stuff, would you include these kind of details about yourself? I mean, most of us would say, no. If I'm making up details, I'm going to write the story a particular way. I'm going to know what Jesus is talking about before he even says it. I'm with you, Jesus. I got it. I'm going to be the one who stands with him to the end faithfully. In his hour of need, I will be there praying, holding him up. I will be there standing at the cross with him. I'll be fighting off the Roman soldiers with him. I'll be waiting at the tomb for him to come out of the tomb any second now, he's coming. I'd be the first to boldly proclaim fearlessly to my death that Jesus is risen if I'm making up the story. You see, the only reason the New Testament writers include these things about themselves is, unfortunately, they're telling the truth. They're telling things the way they happened. Second, we can know the New Testament writers were telling the truth because they include divergent details on the stories. This is something the skeptics will often point to as a problem with the New Testament. That you have, particularly in the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you have them all telling some of the same stories about the life of Jesus, but they'll have different details. For instance, how many angels were actually at the tomb? One gospel writer says 1, another gospel writer says 2. How many blind men did Jesus heal outside of Jericho? One gospel writer says 1, another says 2. How many demon-possessed men did Jesus heal in Gennesaret? One gospel writer says 1, another says 2. You have a couple contradictions apparent like this in the Gospels. So some say, this shows that the Bible is flawed and it's unreliable. But actually, I believe it's these differences, these variances in stories that actually give credibility to the Bible and to the stories. See, the stories in the Gospels are taken from these eyewitnesses' accounts, these 4 different eyewitness accounts, or in some cases, they're interviewing even more eyewitnesses to put their stories together. And any modern day investigator knows that 4 different people or 10 different people who see the same event, each one of them is going to have a different story, a different perspective. They're going to notice different things about the story. Each one is going to tell the story a bit differently. And that's to be expected. I mean, it gives credibility to the story. If people were to come in and they all tell exactly the same details in exactly the same order with exactly the same word, that clues an investigator off that something is fishy, that there's collusion or collaboration taking place. In other words, the eyewitnesses have gotten together beforehand to make sure all their facts line up so they could tell the same story. And the fact that there are divergent details means that there was no collaboration from these guys getting together and saying, now, how many guys do you think we should have them heal from blindness outside of Jericho? 1, 2, let's get on the same page. No, there's no collaboration going on. They're remembering the story as they remember it. They're telling the details that stood out to them from their perspective, and that's what you would expect to get from multiple eyewitness accounts. And just one final point about the divergent detail argument is that it really shows the integrity with which the Bible was copied down through the centuries. Because it would have been very easy 200, 300, 400 AD as the copyists are kind of copying the Bible again and again to just kind of get together and say, you know what, why don't we get on the same page here? Why don't we change Mark's version of the story and have him put 2 people were healed of blindness so he can agree with Matthew? Can we just, that's going to clear up a lot of confusion later on down in the 20th century. But they didn't do that because they were so committed to copying the Bible with incredible integrity and accuracy. That just, again, shows that the Bible can be trusted for its accuracy. There's a lot of reasons we can give as to why the New Testament writers told the truth. Like I said, there's 10 listed in the book. We could talk about the embarrassing details that they tell about Jesus. There's embarrassing stuff about Jesus in there, or his hard teaching. Things that you would never make up if you're kind of making up a story. Or we could look at the fact that they continually challenge their readers. Go find eyewitnesses. Verify what I'm telling you. This wasn't done in a corner. Lots of people saw these things. But perhaps the most persuasive argument is that the New Testament writers were willing to stick to their stories in the face of persecution and torture and death. Nearly to a man, every one of them, they suffered torture, imprisonment, flogging, public mocking, and eventually a very painful, horrific death as a result of the stories they told. Now, you may say, and as I've heard before, lots of people die for what they believe in. That doesn't mean what they believe in is right. And that's true. Lots of people die for what they believe in. That doesn't mean what they believe in is true. We all know today, we could just turn on the news and we know that Muslim extremists are blowing themselves up because of what they believe in. They believe that they're going to be welcomed into heaven with special honor. That doesn't mean that what they believe is true. Lots of people die for what they believe, but here's the crucial difference. While people are willing to die for what they believe in, how many people would be willing to die for what they know is a lie? Because that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about a bunch of men who got together and embellished stories and told lies. Who is going to die for that? Who is not going to crack when the fire gets a little too close, the pain gets a little too intense, the cost gets a little too high? Okay, we were making it up. Okay, yeah. It didn't really happen. It's a lie. Who's going to die for a lie? Certainly one of them would have cracked, but none of them did. All of them died. Not because of what they believed to be true, but because of what they saw with their eyes, what changed them forever. We can know the New Testament writers were eyewitnesses who told the truth. They didn't embellish. They didn't exaggerate. They didn't make these things up. What did they have to gain other than persecution and death? In reality, they had every reason to deny the very stories they continued to tell. It would have saved them a whole lot of pain. Something dramatic must have happened to jolt them into a new belief system that promised them nothing but earthly trouble. And in light of all this, I don't have enough faith to be skeptical about the New Testament. And so next week, we're going to conclude this series by circling back to where we started in week 1 and looking at this audacious claim of Jesus, that we would know who he said he is by this one telling miracle. They're going to kill me, and 3 days later, I'm coming out of the tomb alive. Let's pray. Father in heaven, Lord, I want to thank you for this book, this compilation of 27 different stories that have been preserved so well, that tell a story so compelling, that has changed the course of history. Thank you for the evidence, Father, that this is more than myth or legend or story, but that there is evidence we can hang our faith on. Evidence that lets us know it's reasonable to believe these things this book talks about. And Father, wherever we are in our spiritual journey right now, for the believer who's been kind of wavering in their faith, wondering really if all of this is true, Father, may their faith be girded up today based on the evidence. And Father, for those who are on the other side of things, maybe even on the starting point of things, wondering whether trust in you or following you is reasonable, may we see, Father, that there's more than enough evidence to make following you more than reasonable, but logical, beautiful. Give us the courage to take the next step in our journey, Father. May we each encounter this God who died and rose again. And we pray it in his name. Amen.